Have you ever looked around a room full of people who share your last name only to feel like you're quietly holding up the ceiling while everyone else laughs below it? Maybe you know what it's like to be the reliable one, the fixer, the phone call at midnight, the first to arrive, and the last to leave. My name is Olivia Turner, and for most of my life, I wore the title of family anchor, like a badge I didn't remember earning. But let me ask you this. What happens when the person everyone leans on finally steps away? If you've ever wondered how far a family's expectations can stretch before they finally snap, you're not alone. Today I'm sharing a story that isn't just about being left out. It's about what it costs to always say yes, and what it means to start saying no. I'll take you inside the small moments most people never notice: the late-night text for just one more favor, the birthday dinner, where you pay the bill but aren't in the photos, the quiet ache that grows when giving becomes a habit and gratitude fades away. But this isn't a story of bitterness. It's a story of recognition, of reclaiming yourself, when the lines between love and obligation blur beyond recognition. I'll show you how one decision made on an ordinary Thursday afternoon set off a chain of events that changed not only my relationship with my family, but also with myself. And maybe, just maybe, it will help you see your own story in a new light. Before we dive in, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been called the strong one, the dependable sibling, the glue that keeps things together? Drop a comment below if that label feels a little too familiar. And if you've ever reached a breaking point where silence seemed safer than speaking up, I invite you to stay with me, because this is a safe place for real stories, real feelings, and real change. So what are you holding together right now, and who would you be if you finally let go? Let's find out together. This is Olivia's story, but it could be anyone's. It could even be yours. Let's begin. If you had met me at any point over the past 10 years, you might have mistaken me for someone who simply has it together. I was the dependable daughter who sent birthday cards on time, the older sister who always knew where the spare car keys were, the neighbor who brought soup when someone got the flu. My life in Denver looked calm from the outside 2-bedroom apartment, a quiet job in finance, Friday dinners with friends. But beneath that surface, I carried a silent weight. It was the kind of burden that builds up slowly like snow on a roof, each flake light on its own, but heavy when you add up the years. Most people never noticed. I didn't complain. I didn't want to be a problem. That's how it starts, I think, by wanting to be easy to love. Growing up, my family didn't talk about feelings much. My dad was a retired mechanic, my mom a nurse who worked double shifts so we'd have a little extra. My little brother Sam was the sensitive one, the artist, the dreamer, the kid who once tried to build a time machine out of old VCR parts. I learned early that if I wanted things to run smoothly, I had to be the steady one. I kept track of appointments, remembered when Dad's insurance needed renewing, and quietly made sure the bills were paid on time. Sometimes I'd find myself at the kitchen table at midnight, color-coding our family calendar, my parents asleep down the hall. Nobody asked me to do it. It just seemed easier than watching things fall apart. I was proud in a way of how invisible my help could be. What people don't see is how these little responsibilities multiply. It's easy to say yes just this once. Can you cover Mom's copay this month? Can you pick up groceries after work? Sam needs a ride to the airport, would you mind? Each request sounded so reasonable, and at first they were. But as the years rolled by, the requests grew bolder. There was the time I missed a friend's wedding because Dad's truck broke down on the way to his doctor's appointment, or when I skipped a work conference to stay home with Sam after his knee surgery, even though he was already 27 and mostly needed company. The funny thing about being reliable is that the more you do, the more people expect. Soon, your own needs slip quietly to the bottom of the list. One day you look up and realize you don't remember the last time someone asked how you were holding up. I think the hardest part wasn't the money or the errands. It was the way thank you faded from the conversation, replaced by a quiet assumption that I would always step in. I started to feel less like a daughter and more like an insurance policy. My therapist, yes, I finally saw one after a long push from a coworker, called it invisible labor. She told me that in a lot of American families, the person who takes care of everything is rarely seen for who they are. Instead, they become the background, the silent system that keeps the lights on. It was comforting to have someone name it, but it also stung. I wondered if I stopped, would the whole house fall apart? or would everyone just find someone else to lean on? There's a moment that stands out now, even years later. It was a Tuesday in late October, just after a cold snap. I came home from work to find my mom sitting on my apartment steps, wrapped in a too-thin cardigan, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. She handed me a bag of groceries and a note that just said, "Thanks for being you." We talked for hours that night about her worries, her regrets, her hopes for Sam. When she left, I felt both full and hollow. Full because I mattered enough for her to come find me. Hollow because she never once asked what was weighing on me. That's the thing about being the strong one, people forget you're carrying anything at all. If there's a lesson in all of this, maybe it's that you can be the backbone of a family and still feel invisible. We don't always notice the burdens we place on others, especially when they never complain. Sometimes the person who seems the most stable is the one holding the heaviest load. If you're listening to this and see yourself in these words, I want you to remember, being reliable is a gift, but it doesn't mean you owe everyone everything. Your needs matter too. Looking back, I wish I'd learned that lesson sooner, but for a long time I thought my role was set in stone. Olivia the dependable, Olivia the fixer. Olivia who never drops the ball. Little did I know life was about to ask me to carry even more, and this time, the cost would be greater than I could have imagined. That's when everything began to change, and that's where our story continues. It's funny how the biggest sacrifices rarely come as a single grand gesture. More often, they slip quietly into our lives disguised as tiny choices. Each one so small it hardly feels like a choice at all. I remember the first time I turned down something for myself because my family needed me. I'd just received an offer for a summer study program in New York, the kind of thing I'd dreamed about since high school. But Mom's back went out and Dad was already covering extra shifts at the shop. Sam, as usual, was lost in his own world, so the chores and errands fell to me. I called the program director and made up an excuse. Maybe next year, I told myself, though. I never applied again. Looking back, it's easy to see how quickly one yes led to another. After college, I was offered a job in Portland. It wasn't my dream role, but it was a fresh start in a new city. The same week, Dad was diagnosed with high blood pressure, and Sam crashed his old sedan on an icy road. Mom called, her voice trembling, and said, "I don't know what we'd do without you." That sentence became a refrain over the years, sometimes spoken out loud, sometimes silent, but understood. So I stayed. I told myself I'd move someday, but someday never came. Friends asked why I was still in Denver when I could have been anywhere. I never had a good answer that made sense to anyone but me. It's easy in hindsight to judge ourselves for the things we gave up. But the truth is, I didn't feel trapped, at least not at first. There's a kind of pride in being needed. It feels good to know you can make a difference, that your presence is the glue holding everything together. My best friend Monica saw it differently. She moved to Seattle right after college, chasing her own dreams, even when her family tried to guilt her into staying. She used to call me after rough days and ask, "When is it your turn?" Liv, I'd laugh it off, tell her I was happy where I was. But sometimes late at night, her words echoed louder than I cared to admit. The line between sacrifice and surrender is razor thin. At what point does saying yes to others become a quiet surrender of your own hopes? For me, the shift was so gradual, I hardly noticed it. There was always one more reason to stay: a hospital bill, a broken furnace, Sam's latest crisis. I missed out on more than jobs and travel. I watched friends fall in love, move away, build lives in cities I'd only ever seen on postcards. Sometimes I'd scroll through their photos and wonder what my life would have looked like if I'd made just one different choice. Would I be happier, or would I still find a way to worry about everyone else no matter where I landed? Sacrifice is woven into the fabric of so many families, especially in America. We're taught that putting others first is a virtue, that family comes first no matter the cost. I believed it may be too much. My therapist once told me being a caretaker is admirable, but not if it costs you everything. That's a lesson I struggled to accept. I convinced myself that one day my turn would come, that someday my family would notice and reward my loyalty. But life has a way of moving the goalposts. Just when you think you've done enough, something new comes along, and the cycle starts all over again. I remember one Thanksgiving when Monica flew back to visit her parents. She invited me to join their family dinner. Her mom pulled me aside in the kitchen and said, You know, honey, it's okay to put yourself first. That doesn't mean you love your family any less. It was such a simple thing to say, but it landed like a revelation. I realized then how rare it was to hear those words, how much I needed to. In my family, love and duty were tangled so tightly, I couldn't see where one ended and the other began. If I could offer any advice to someone listening, it would be this. Saying yes can be beautiful. It can be an act of love, a gift to the people who matter most. But if you always say yes, your own dreams start to shrink slowly, at first, then all at once. You wake up one day and realize you don't know what you want anymore. Or worse, you're afraid to ask. Sacrifice isn't a bad thing, but surrendering yourself entirely isn't noble. It's just lonely. I wish I'd understood that distinction sooner. I wish someone had told me it's possible to love your family deeply, without losing yourself in the process. Sometimes no is the kindest word you can offer, not just for yourself, but for the people who rely on you. Boundaries are not the opposite of love. In fact, they're what make love sustainable. As the years passed, I found myself on a path that felt less like a choice and more like fate. The world I'd carefully built around my family was about to shift, and this time it wouldn't be a gradual change. It would come suddenly like a storm rolling in on a clear day, unexpected, unstoppable, and impossible to ignore. That's when everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and sacrifice would be put to the test. If you asked me to point to a single day when my view of my family changed forever, I could give you the exact date. It was a chilly Wednesday afternoon, the kind where autumn winds rattle loose leaves down empty sidewalks. I'd stopped by my parents' house after work, expecting nothing more dramatic than the usual stack of bills to organize and a cup of overbrewed tea. My mother was in the kitchen, humming, my father glued to his crossword. I was sorting through paperwork on the dining table, my mind half on an upcoming deadline, when I found it an envelope stamped with the words, "Last Will and Testament." At first, I barely registered what it was. Wills weren't unusual. My parents liked to be prepared for anything, as they always said. But as I flipped through the pages, my eyes darting from clause to clause, a cold shock prickled up my spine. Everything, the house, the savings, even the old lake cabin, was left to Sam. There was my name just once in a line that read, "We trust our daughter Olivia will understand." That was it. No explanation. No mention of the years I'd spent quietly keeping the family together, no acknowledgement of the birthdays. Missed the jobs, turned down the nights spent in hospital waiting rooms. It was as if all I'd done simply didn't count. In that moment, the world felt suddenly quieter, like the air had been sucked out of the room. My mother came in asking if I wanted a refill on my tea. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked her about the will. She sighed and said, "Sam just needs it more, honey. You're so stable, you'll be fine. We knew you'd understand." I wanted to argue, to demand some justification, but my words wouldn't come. I felt stripped bare, not just of inheritance, but of recognition of all the invisible things I'd carried for years. It was as if someone had erased my name from the story and left a blank space in its place. This wasn't the first time I'd heard of families making choices that leave one member feeling cut out. My coworker Jasmine once confided that her brother had inherited their parents' entire estate simply because he needed more help. She told me how the pain lingered, not because of the money, but because it felt like her love, her loyalty, her sacrifices were never truly seen. Hearing her story years before, I'd offered comfort, not realizing how close I would one day come to living it myself. There's a special kind of heartbreak in realizing that all your quiet acts of devotion can vanish from memory with the stroke of a pen. The days after I found the will are a blur in my memory. I kept showing up at work, at family dinners, on the phone with Sam as he rambled about his latest scheme. Outwardly, nothing changed. But inside, everything was different. I began to question every yes I'd ever said. Did it matter? Was I only valued for what I could provide, not for who I was? I started losing sleep, replaying old conversations in my head, wondering if I'd missed the warning signs. Maybe the truth was there all along, tucked inside 1,000 casual remarks about Sam being the one who struggles, or me being the strong one. Maybe deep down, I already knew how the story would end. The hardest part wasn't the material loss. It was the erasure, the way my parents assumed my understanding was endless, that I'd be grateful just to be trusted, that I'd never need anything more than a pat on the back. The lesson I learned, painful as it was, is that love without acknowledgement becomes an invisible burden. It's not enough to assume someone knows they matter. You have to say it, show it, name it out loud. Otherwise, even the strongest ties can unravel in silence. I wish I could say I confronted my parents, that I demanded an explanation and received the closure I needed. But the truth is, I didn't have the words, not then. I left their house that evening with the will folded in my purse and a heaviness in my chest that wouldn't leave for weeks. At home, I sat alone on my bed, the city lights blinking outside my window, and cried for the version of myself who still believed that loyalty would be enough. What came next wasn't rage or revenge. It was something quieter, a slow, simmering grief that made me reevaluate everything I thought I knew about family love and my own worth. I began to see the difference between being needed and being valued, between duty and connection. And for the first time, I wondered what my life would look like if I stopped holding up the roof alone. That's when the ground truly began to shift beneath my feet, when the story I'd told myself about my family started to crack open, letting in the possibility of something new. In the chapters ahead, I'd learn what it really means to draw boundaries and rediscover yourself after being written out of the script. But on that night in the quiet of my apartment, all I knew was this: nothing would ever be the same again. There's a strange alchemy that happens in families when loyalty and love become tangled with expectation. For a long time, I told myself that being the dependable one was a gift, a badge of honor, something to be quietly proud of. But after the will, I began to notice all the little ways my family's gratitude had shifted into assumption, and how those assumptions grew roots deep and unspoken. The smallest request began to feel heavier, and the familiar refrain of "you're so stable," Olivia, started to sound less like a compliment and more like a sentence. One night, just a week after the discovery, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off groceries. Sam was already there, sprawled on the couch, watching basketball. As I set bags on the counter, Mom handed me a list, just a few errands for the week: paying the insurance, picking up Dad's medication, helping Sam with his taxes. It would have been easy to say yes. After all, I'd always said yes. But something in me balked. "Why can't Sam help with this?" I asked. My mother smiled, patient, but tired. "Oh, Liv, you know how overwhelmed he gets. You're just so much better at this stuff." Her voice was sweet, but her eyes told me the answer was already decided. For years, I'd confused this kind of expectation for love. Manipulation, I've learned, doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it's dressed in kindness, wrapped in the language of need. "Only you can handle this," they say, or "we'd be lost without you." There's a subtle pressure, a sense that if you don't step up, you're letting everyone down. My friend Anthony once described it perfectly. It's like they hand you a life raft and then poke holes in it unless you keep paddling. His story was eerily similar to mine. He became the caretaker for his aging grandmother, and every time he tried to step back, guilt came flooding in. Guilt, I realized, is the currency of emotional debt in families like ours. For years, I thought my willingness to help made me indispensable, and maybe it did. But indispensability is a lonely place. It's not really about being loved, it's about being needed, and those are not the same thing. Sometimes the line between loyalty and obligation blurs so much you can't see where one ends and the other begins. Every favor granted, every extra shift covered, every moment of quiet understanding slowly turns into a weight you carry alone. And the more you carry, the more is asked of you, until you begin to believe that your worth is measured in sacrifices made. There are times I wish I'd pushed back sooner. Looking back, there were so many moments I could have drawn a line, like the night Sam called at midnight to say he'd locked his keys in his car and could I just run over real quick. Or when Dad asked me to review his retirement paperwork instead of his financial advisor because I trust you more. Each time I said yes, convincing myself it was easier than arguing. But with every yes, I built a cage out of my own reliability. By the time I realized what was happening, it was hard to remember who I was before the cage was built. Here's what I wish someone had told me: true loyalty is not about blind obedience. It's about trust, respect, and the willingness to care for each other without strings attached. Manipulation thrives where boundaries are weak, and emotional debt only grows when repayment is never enough. If you feel trapped by love, it's not really love, it's a bargain disguised as devotion. And while family bonds can be beautiful, they should never require you to trade away your peace, just to keep everyone else comfortable. The first time I said no after the will, it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a simple refusal. I told Mom I couldn't take on Sam's taxes, that I was overwhelmed with my own work. The room went silent, thick with disappointment. But to my surprise, the world didn't end. Sam grumbled, but eventually figured it out. Dad muttered about kids these days, but the sun still rose the next morning. The lesson, though small, was powerful. Boundaries don't break families. They reveal the real shape of the relationships inside them. Of course, change is rarely welcomed with open arms. As I learned to say no, the guilt trips intensified. Calls from Mom, laced with sadness. Sam's sulking silence, Dad's short remarks about family duty. I started to see just how much my willingness to bend kept everything else in place. It hurt, but it also set me free. For the first time in my adult life, I realized I could choose what I wanted to carry and what I needed to let go. The journey was only beginning. The will had opened my eyes, but the hardest part was still ahead, unlearning a lifetime of habits and discovering who I was when I wasn't playing the part everyone expected. In the next part of my story, I'll share what it's like to be erased from the narrative, to watch as your own history is rewritten without you in it, and how I learned to reclaim the truth one piece at a time. There's a unique kind of heartbreak that comes not from being criticized or blamed, but from being quietly written out of the story. After the will, I expected anger, maybe even confrontation. What I didn't expect was silence, my role in the family slipping into the background like a favorite song turned down so low you can barely hear it. It started with small things, group photos shared online, where I was absent, family group texts. I was no longer included in even inside jokes that suddenly didn't make sense to me. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence, but the pattern grew unmistakable. It was as if by stepping back, I'd given everyone permission to pretend I was never there. The most painful moment came a few weeks later during the annual family barbecue. I wasn't invited, but a neighbor texted me a picture she'd taken from her backyard, my brother and parents smiling under the big oak tree, the one I'd helped plant years ago. The caption read, "Turner family together through everything." There was Sam at the grill, Dad laughing with a plate in his hand, Mom hugging a new grandchild I'd never met. The photo radiated warmth, togetherness, a story of unity and resilience. It would have been beautiful if not for the hollow space where I should have been. In that moment, I understood what it meant to be erased, not with malice, but with a gentle indifference that hurt even more. Social media, too, has its own way of rewriting history. My mom posted a heartfelt status about the journey our family has been on. So grateful for my rock, my son, and the new chapter ahead. Comments poured in. "You have such a wonderful family. Sam's really stepped up for you all." No mention of the years I paid the mortgage or handled their insurance calls. No nod to the birthdays I spent at home so they wouldn't be alone. Even distant relatives chimed in, celebrating the strength of the Turner family. I stared at the screen, feeling invisible. In a room full of people who had known me since childhood. The urge to reply to set the record straight burned inside me. But I closed the app instead, unwilling to fight for space in a story that no longer felt like mine. It isn't only families who do this. I've heard from friends and strangers alike stories of being left out, minimized, or quietly rewritten out of the narrative after standing up for themselves. My coworker Maya, for instance, was her grandmother's primary caregiver for years. When her grandmother passed, the family obituary omitted her entirely, focusing instead on the siblings who lived closest. Maya told me the pain wasn't about recognition or glory. It was about being seen for who she was and what she gave. We all want that, don't we? To know our love meant something, to feel like our story mattered, even if only to a handful of people. The lesson here is a hard one. You can't make people see the truth if they're invested in a different version of the story. Some families, some groups need their narrative of togetherness so badly that they'll erase anything or anyone that disrupts it. It's not fair, but it's common. The more I tried to force my way back in, the lonelier I felt. I realized that my sense of self, my worth, couldn't depend on whether I was tagged in a photo or mentioned in a speech. I had to find a new way to honor my story, even if I was the only one who knew its chapters by heart. One small but powerful shift happened when I began to document my own history. I started a folder on my laptop called For Me. In it, I collected photos, receipts, emails proof of all the things I'd done, not for validation, but for clarity. The act of gathering evidence was healing. Each item was a small act of self-respect, a reminder that I was there even if no one else remembered. Over time, that folder became a quiet anchor, a place where my reality was safe from revision. It didn't erase the pain of exclusion, but it gave me a sense of agency I'd been missing. What I've learned is this: you can't control how people remember you or whether they remember you at all. What you can control is the story you tell yourself. You can choose to honor your own contribution, to remember your sacrifices, and to keep your truth alive even when the world wants to move on without you. Being erased from someone else's narrative doesn't mean you disappear from your own. That understanding was bittersweet, but it marked a turning point. With each small act of self-recognition, I grew a little stronger. I stopped fighting to be let back in and started looking for ways to build a new narrative, one where I was more than the family fixer or the silent helper. The next challenge I realized would be even harder, learning to put value on the invisible labor I'd always done, and making peace with the things I could never change. In the next part, I'll talk about what it really means to keep score, not in a petty or resentful way, but as a necessary act of self-care. We'll explore the true cost of invisible labor, both in dollars and in spirit, and how I learned that acknowledging your contribution is the first step to reclaiming your life. If you've ever been the one who quietly keeps things running, you know how invisible labor feels. It's not just the laundry or the errands or the "can you just" texts that land at midnight. It's the silent daily vigilance, watching bills, monitoring medication being the backup plan no one ever officially schedules. For most of my life, I didn't keep track. There was no spreadsheet of hours spent driving dad to appointments, no ledger of late fees avoided, because I caught a mistake on mom's insurance paperwork. Like so many caretakers, I believed love didn't require receipts. But after the will, something changed. It wasn't about revenge or even recognition, it was about clarity. I needed to see for myself the shape of what I'd given. So late one Sunday afternoon, I sat down with a mug of coffee and started a list. First came the big things, the 4 years of mortgage payments I'd quietly picked up when Dad lost his job. The summer I used my vacation days to help Sam recover from surgery. The weekends spent managing my parents' medical claims. But then came the little things: birthday cakes baked from scratch, endless trips to the pharmacy, the time I canceled a date to fix the dishwasher before it flooded the kitchen. Every line on that list was a memory, an offering pieces of a life built on care. I spoke to a friend, Emily, who had cared for her grandfather in his final years. She told me, you don't realize how much you're giving away until you start writing it down. It's like watching sand slip through your fingers, only when the hourglass is empty. Do you see what's gone? Her words resonated. In America, we talk about family values, but rarely about the value of family work, the unpaid, unacknowledged tasks that make life possible. Studies show that unpaid caregivers, mostly women, contribute billions of dollars of invisible labor every year, yet so few of us pause to measure what we've given. For me, the numbers were startling. I tallied hours spent on errands and administrative tasks, and came up with nearly 800 hours a year, almost 5 months of full-time work. Financially, the total was more than I wanted to admit. And that was only the beginning. The emotional cost, the sleep lost, the relationships quietly neglected. The slow erosion of my own ambitions was harder to calculate, but no less real. It hit me then by never keeping score. I'd made it easy for everyone else not to either. It isn't about holding a grudge or demanding repayment. Keeping score is about seeing the full picture, understanding your own limits. It's about acknowledging that love and labor are not the same, and that boundaries are necessary, not just to protect yourself, but to ensure that what you give is truly a gift, not an expectation or a silent demand. The act of writing it down for me was a turning point. I began to realize that honoring your own work is not selfish, it's healthy. One of the lessons I learned was that you can't expect others to value what you keep invisible. If you never speak up, never show the work, you become the background noise, reliable, unremarkable, and ultimately overlooked. That doesn't make your love less true, but it does make your story harder to tell. If you're listening and you've spent years being the glue, I hope you'll take a moment to write down what you've given. It's not about bragging. It's about recognizing that your story is worth remembering even if you're the only one who remembers it. As my list grew, so did my resolve. I began to see patterns, moments where I could have asked for help, opportunities to teach my family that care is a shared responsibility, not a private burden. I started small, delegating simple tasks to Sam, suggesting Dad handle his own appointments when possible. Sometimes they resisted. Other times they surprised me by stepping up. The world didn't end because I asked for support. If anything, it became more honest. Yet keeping score also brought pain. It forced me to see how much of myself I'd given away and how easy it had been for others to accept my silence. The cost was real, but so was the opportunity for change. By facing it head-on, I reclaimed a piece of myself that had been fading. I realized I could choose what I wanted to offer going forward instead of feeling obligated to give until I was empty. With this newfound clarity, I felt ready to take the next step, building boundaries, legal, financial, and emotional, that would protect my time, my resources, and my sense of self. In the next part, I'll share how I learned to draw those lines, the challenges that came with it, and the freedom that slowly began to grow as a result. Learning to draw boundaries after a lifetime of quiet accommodation is like waking up in a house you've lived in for years, and suddenly realizing you don't have to clean every room. For so long, I believed being a good daughter meant solving every problem before it reached anyone else. But as I began to tally up my invisible labor, I saw just how necessary boundaries really are, not as walls, but as gentle fences that define what is and isn't mine to carry. Still, it's one thing to recognize the need for limits, and another to actually enforce them, especially when it means changing a whole family's habits. I started with the simplest step: money. I sat down with my parents at the kitchen table, checkbook in hand, and explained that I could no longer cover the mortgage or emergency expenses. My voice trembled a little, but I held my ground. It's not because I don't love you, I said, but because I need to take care of myself too. The room was heavy with silence. My father, always practical, nodded slowly. My mother seemed more hurt than angry, her eyes filling with questions she didn't quite ask. For the first time, I left without agreeing to pick up a bill. It was uncomfortable, almost physically so. But I also felt lighter, as if some invisible weight had shifted from my shoulders back to its rightful place. Setting legal boundaries was even more daunting. I contacted a lawyer, explained my situation, and with her help removed my name from shared accounts and household titles. It wasn't out of spite, but out of necessity. My friend Lila, who'd gone through something similar, warned me that guilt would try to creep in. Remember, she said, you're not abandoning them. You're giving everyone a chance to stand on their own. Her words echoed in my mind as I signed paperwork at the notary, as I sat in the car afterward, hands shaking but spirit steady. That act felt like reclaiming my adulthood all over again. But emotional boundaries proved the most challenging. My family, especially my mother and brother, were used to my open-door policy. If something went wrong, I'd fix it. Now I was learning to say, I'm sorry, I can't help this time, and letting the silence stand. Sometimes my mom would call, voice tight with disappointment, and I'd have to sit with the discomfort. Sam sent guilt-laced texts reminding me of all the times I'd been there before. It hurt deeply, but I reminded myself that rescuing others at my own expense had only left me depleted. My therapist taught me to practice small scripts, ways to say no without explanation, to choose honesty over appeasement. No, I'm not available. I trust you can figure it out. These words felt strange at first, like shoes that didn't quite fit. But each time I said them, I grew more sure-footed. For anyone listening, I want to offer this small lesson. Boundaries are not punishments. They are invitations for healthier relationships. They say I value myself and I value you enough to be honest. Sometimes people will resist. Sometimes they'll accuse you of being selfish, dramatic, or ungrateful. But with every line you draw, you reclaim a piece of your life, and you invite those around you to do the same. In time, some will adapt. Others may not. The goal isn't to change them, it's to protect your peace. As I navigated these new boundaries, I realized just how much of my old identity was tied to being the fixer. There were nights I felt deeply lonely, missing the comfort of being needed. But slowly that loneliness gave way to a quiet freedom. My time was my own again. My resources, energy, money, attention were things I could give or keep by choice rather than obligation. I began to dream again, not just about what I could do for others, but about what I wanted for myself. Still, the road was far from easy. Each act of boundary setting brought new challenges, pushback from family, moments of self-doubt, the temptation to fall back into old patterns. But the more I persisted, the more I saw that boundaries weren't about shutting people out. They were about letting the right things in. I was learning to create a life with room for rest, joy, and growth, a life where I wasn't always living on call. With these fences in place, something unexpected happened. I began to notice the cost of saying yes all those years, not just to my wallet, but to my heart and my dreams. The boundaries I set didn't just keep exhaustion at bay. They opened the door to healing, to discovering what was possible beyond the familiar cycle of rescue and regret. In the next part of my story, I'll share what it felt like to sit in that space of loneliness and backlash, and how even in isolation, the seeds of true strength and self-respect began to take root. When you finally begin to say no, after years of always saying yes, the world doesn't just slip back into balance. Sometimes it tilts further off its axis before settling into a new rhythm. For me, the first months after drawing boundaries with my family were unexpectedly quiet. Calls from my mom, once daily, slowed to a trickle. Sam's texts, once insistent, became rare and clipped. At first I panicked. Had I gone too far? Was I really as selfish or dramatic as the whispered family verdict seemed to suggest? There were nights when the silence in my apartment felt almost physical, a presence pressing in where noise and need used to be. I found myself missing the chaos even as I knew it was unhealthy. On weekends, I caught myself staring at my phone, willing it to ring, longing for anyone to check in. The absence of requests felt less like freedom and more like exile. Social gatherings with extended family were awkward. There were glances and half-finished sentences, as if everyone had been handed a script I hadn't seen. At a cousin's wedding, an aunt squeezed my hand and said, "I hope you find your way back," as if I'd wandered off and gotten lost, not chosen a new direction on purpose. These small slights added up, and I often questioned whether the pain of exclusion was worse than the pain of being needed for all the wrong reasons. In the quiet, though, I started to notice something I'd never seen before. The stories people told themselves about my absence had less to do with me and more to do with the roles they wanted me to play. One evening, I overheard Sam explaining to a friend that I was just too busy for family now. It stung, but it also clarified something essential. People will create their own explanations for your boundaries, often to protect their comfort, not your truth. That realization was freeing. It meant I didn't have to correct every misconception or beg to be understood. My boundaries didn't need to make sense to anyone but me. It helped to connect with others who'd been through similar reckonings. I found an online support group for adult children setting boundaries with their families. There I met people from all walks of life, nurses, teachers, artists, engineers, each with a story that echoed my own. One woman, Carol, shared how her father called her cold for refusing to manage his business books after retirement. Another man, David, confessed that his sisters stopped inviting him to Sunday dinner once he declined to bail them out of credit card debt. Their stories were different, but the through line was the same: when you stop giving, you become difficult. But as Carol wrote, sometimes being the villain in someone else's story is the only way to become the hero in your own. The lesson was slow to sink in. I'd spent so long tying my self-worth to how useful I was that letting go felt dangerous. But gradually I came to see the loneliness not as punishment but as possibility. There was space now, space for my own feelings, my own ambitions, my own joys. I took up hobbies I'd set aside for years. I began baking again, not because anyone expected dessert at a family dinner, but because I loved the smell of bread in my kitchen. I read novels late into the night without guilt. Sometimes I volunteered at the animal shelter on Saturdays, coming home tired, but fulfilled my heart full in a way that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval. One chilly afternoon, I ran into an old college friend at the park. We caught up on life, laughing about small things and sharing honest truths about bigger ones. She listened without judgment as I described the rift with my family. "I think you're brave," she said. "Most people stay in roles that hurt them just to keep the peace." Her words felt like a balm, reminding me that peace built on self-abandonment is no peace at all. If you find yourself alone after standing up for your needs, I want you to know that the loneliness is temporary, but the lessons are lasting. There is value in solitude, a clarity and gentleness that can't be found in noise and people-pleasing. The world won't always understand your decision to choose yourself, but that doesn't make it wrong. Sometimes the space you create by letting go of old obligations is the same space where healing, growth, and new love can finally take root. As I began to fill my days with things that truly nourished me, I realized I wasn't waiting for my family's approval anymore. I was learning to approve of myself, to celebrate my boundaries as an act of courage, not rebellion. The backlash faded. In its place, I found a deeper, quieter strength, a self-respect that would become the foundation for everything to come. In the next part, I'll share how this newfound space became the soil for real healing and connection. I'll talk about the communities I discovered, the new friendships I built, and how step by step I began to reclaim not just my story, but my joy. The beauty of boundaries is that over time, they become more than lines of defense, they turn into invitations for new beginnings. In the stillness that followed the backlash and loneliness, I gradually began to recognize the quiet possibilities that were opening before me. With so much of my energy no longer bound up in constant vigilance and rescue, I started to ask myself questions I hadn't considered in years. What do I enjoy? What brings me peace? Who am I when I am not what my family needs? At first, rediscovering my own interests felt awkward, like moving into a house with unfamiliar rooms. The urge to check in with my mother or reply to Sam's requests lingered, but I let those moments pass. I signed up for a beginner's pottery class at a local studio where my lopsided bowls and clumsy vases earned gentle laughs and warm encouragement. They're surrounded by people with no expectations of me. I felt a sense of belonging that was simple and pure. It wasn't about proving my usefulness, but about exploring curiosity and joy, one lump of clay at a time. Slowly, I broadened my world. I joined a book club at the library where our discussions wandered from novels to life itself. Family heartbreak, dreams, and reinvention. I began volunteering at a Saturday breakfast program for people experiencing homelessness, and the act of serving coffee and sharing conversation felt healing in a new way. In these circles, I found others with stories like mine, people who had walked away from toxic ties and were bravely building new lives on their own terms. One woman, Sarah, shared how she'd left a family business that drained her, and another, Marcus, described finding real community for the first time in a cycling group. These stories gave me hope and reminded me I wasn't starting from scratch, I was starting from experience. Therapy too became an anchor. With my therapist's guidance, I learned to identify old patterns, the reflex to overextend, the guilt that crept in when I put myself first. She helped me practice self-compassion, encouraging me to treat myself with the same patience I'd always shown others. Together, we celebrated every milestone, the first birthday I spent entirely on my own terms, the day I turned down an unnecessary request, without guilt, the morning I woke up feeling genuinely excited for what lay ahead. Healing is rarely a straight line, and there were setbacks along the way. Some days loneliness would return unexpectedly, like a cold wind through an open window. There were moments when I missed the familiarity of my old role, when I ached for the comfort of routine, even a routine built on self-sacrifice. But each time I reminded myself that missing the past didn't mean I was moving in the wrong direction. It meant I was human, and change, even when chosen, can be bittersweet. One unexpected gift of this journey was learning how to receive support. I'd spent so long being the giver that letting others care for me felt foreign, almost indulgent. But in my new friendships, I discovered the power of mutual aid, the simple, profound comfort of sharing burdens and joys without keeping score. I learned to ask for advice, to say yes to help with moving, to accept dinner invitations, without feeling I had to repay them with extra favors. These small acts built a new foundation, one rooted in trust, reciprocity, and authenticity. The biggest lesson, perhaps, was that identity is not a role to be performed, but a life to be lived. When you begin to shape your days around what brings you alive, instead of what others demand, everything changes. I became more patient with myself, more willing to forgive missteps, and more open to the unpredictability of growth. My sense of worth shifted from how much can I endure to how much can I nurture, not just in others, but in myself. As spring crept into Denver, I found myself planting a small garden on my apartment balcony, tomatoes, herbs, and a wild tangle of morning glories. Each sprout was a quiet declaration I am allowed to grow in new directions. My life like this garden would need tending and patience, but it was finally truly mine. By the time the next family milestone approached an anniversary, a holiday, I realized I was no longer waiting for permission to be happy or for someone else's recognition to make me whole. I could send a card if I felt like it, or simply mark the day in my own way. I could wish them well without returning to the old cycle of rescue and resentment. In the final part of my story, I'll share what closure looked like for me, not a return to what was, but a gentle acceptance of what is. I'll talk about the quiet power of letting go, the grace of forgiveness, including self-forgiveness, and the new forms of love and connection that continue to bloom on the far side of the boundary lines. Closure, I've learned, is less about grand gestures and more about the quiet, almost invisible shifts that happen in the heart. For me, it didn't come in a single conversation or dramatic reunion. It came in slow waves, a letter from my mother tucked into a birthday card, a brief but genuine thank you from Sam on an ordinary Tuesday, a peaceful morning, when I realized I no longer felt angry or owed. Those moments were not apologies in the formal sense, but acknowledgments that even if our stories had diverged, the love we shared still mattered. It was enough. There were days I wondered if forgiveness was possible, especially forgiveness of myself for waiting so long to draw boundaries. Guilt is a shadow that lingers even after the sun comes out. Yet as I reflected on everything I'd experienced, the sacrifices, the resentment, the loneliness, and the healing, I saw that I had always done the best I could with what I knew. That recognition softened something inside me. I could look back with compassion, not regret, and offer myself the same patience I so often reserved for others. Forgiveness, I realized, doesn't require the past to be rewritten. It simply asks us to let go of the hope that things could have been different. Sometimes small gestures become the turning points. I remember one afternoon watering my balcony garden when a neighbor stopped by to ask for basil. We talked about plants and life, sharing quiet laughter. It was so ordinary, so unlike the drama that once filled my days, and yet it felt profound. These moments of connection, built on honesty and presence, were the true markers of my new life. A life shaped not by duty, but by choice. The biggest lesson I carry is, these boundaries are not walls that shut others out. They are bridges that make honest relationships possible. When we say no to what hurts us, we make room for what heals. When we step out of roles that no longer fit, we give ourselves and others the freedom to grow in new directions. Sometimes letting go isn't about closing a chapter, but about opening your hands to something gentler and more real. If you're listening to my story and see yourself in its pages, know that you're not alone. Your journey, with all its detours and difficult choices, is worthy of honor. The pain of setting boundaries will pass, but the peace you gain is yours to keep. Forgiveness of your family, of yourself, is a gift that doesn't need to be rushed. It unfolds in its own time, quietly and without fanfare. Now, as the seasons change again, I find joy in small things. A book finished on a rainy afternoon, the feel of sun-warmed tomatoes in my hands, laughter over coffee with new friends. My life isn't perfect or even completely healed, but it is truly, finally my own. I am not the villain, not the savior, but simply a person learning to live with open eyes and an open heart. If my story touched you, I invite you to share your own in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from, what boundaries you've learned to set, or how you found healing after letting go. Your voice matters here, and if you're just beginning, know that you don't have to carry the weight alone. There are communities, friendships, and fresh chapters waiting on the far side of courage. Thank you for staying with me through this story. I hope wherever you are that you find the freedom to choose your own path and the peace to know you deserve it.